Folks, I have to apologize up front. I too am kind of recovering from a case of the snuffleupagus. So if I do this every once in a while tonight, please don't be upset at me. I want to take this opportunity to give thanks to those who have asked me to resume this class on the study of the Lord's revelation to our Apostle John. At the time of COVID, back in March of 2020, we were about a third of the way through our study of Revelation. This makes the fourth time that I have studied this great book. I absolutely love this book. I love what it teaches us today, and it's just as applicable to us today as it was to them. And I had full intention to pick up basically where I left off and continue on with that study. However, as I look around the class, I see there are different faces that were not part of that class that we started back in 2020. And to be honest with you folks, with this book, without the initial foundation that I laid out concerning the synopsis of the book and how to look at this letter, that would be a complete disadvantage to those that were not part of that original class. If I picked up where I was at, you would not have any idea, most likely, why I'm saying the things that I'm saying and why that I'm laying it out the way that I'm laying it out. Also, at the end of the last class that Jonathan and I taught on Paul's letter to the Romans, folks, there was a single question that was asked that really and truthfully scared me to death. It was then that I knew just how much influence that the world has over the content of the book of Revelation. And I was convinced that I needed to start at the beginning, that I need to lay down the foundation all over again. And as always, let the Lord answer his own questions. And that's what I wanted to do. I decided to name this study Revelation, the Blessed Assurance, or the Lord's Blessed Assurance. Now, why did I decide on that type of a title? Because I can tell you, that's not the title of the first three classes that I taught on Revelation. After reading and really taking a step back and looking at the book in its entirety, it's plain to me that the book of Revelation teaches us that God has given us his blessed assurance that we have victory in Jesus Christ. And in Jesus Christ, we have the Lord's blessed assurance that in the end, guess what? We win. So if I was to summarize the book of Revelation, that's how I would sum it up. Henceforth, the reason why that I chose to call this book the Lord's Blessed Assurance, because that is the assurance that we have. We have victory in Jesus and in Jesus Christ, folks. No matter what, in the end, the price has been paid, the battle has been won, and through the Lord's victory, we win. So for tonight, and for our first class together, I'd like to start out by setting the stage as the world is at the time of the writing of this book. I think it is so important to understand what is going on in the world, what the Christians are having to live in, what the Christians are having to deal with, and why of all things did the Lord put his revelation on John and tell John to write these things down? First of all, at the time of the writing of the book of Revelation, Rome was under the reign of the Emperor Domitian. Now, unfortunately, folks, I don't normally like to teach a lecture class. So I'm going to ask you to please forgive me tonight, because I have to give you this background and I have to lay out this format and this baseline, shall I say, before we ever look at Revelation 1:1. If I don't, when we get there, I'm afraid that you're going to be lost. So I want to lay this out. And I want to lay this out by starting off with Domitian. Domitian was the Roman emperor from AD 81 to AD 96. Now, he was the third and the very last member of the Flavian dynasty. Now, Domitian's father, but I'm going to try to say this, Vespasian, he had two sons. His first son was Titus. He was the oldest. And Domitian was the second now. Vespasian was a Roman general, and it was him that besieged Jerusalem in AD 68 when Nero died. Now, when Nero died, the emperor, the whole Roman Empire was basically thrown into chaos. And Vespasian's son, Titus, he finished the work of destroying Jerusalem in AD 70. And upon the death of his father in AD 79, Titus, he ascended to the throne. Now, if you remember, somebody turn to Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24. If you remember, in the final week of Jesus' ministry, speaking to the apostles on the Mount of Olives, Jesus prophesied the destruction of the temple. Somebody read Matthew 24, verses 1 and 2. Anybody who gets to it first.
I got it.
Okay, go ahead.
Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down."
Now, in this prophecy, later on in Matthew, in chapter 24, verses 15 and 16, Jesus also quoted from the prophet Daniel of the abomination of desolation. The abomination of desolation. And he connected that with the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. And he advised those who wished to be preserved to stand in the holy place and to flee to the mountains. Stand in the holy place and to flee to the mountains. You can see that in verses 15 and 16. Eusebius of Caesarea, who is known as the father of church history, recounted in his book, Church History, just that. He records that the saints in Jerusalem were spared from the destruction of Jerusalem by fleeing across the Jordan River to Plea, just exactly what Jesus had foretold. So the temple became the focal point of the growing conflict between the governing Romans and the Christians that lasted from AD 66 to AD 70, when Titus and the Roman armies besieged and totally destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. As Jesus had prophesied, the temple was burned and totally destroyed, leaving nothing but a pile of rubble. The historian Josephus recorded in his book, The Jewish War, the Roman destruction following the burning of the temple. This is what he writes in his book. Now, he is a historian. Listen to this. Caesar ordered the whole city and the temple to be razed to the ground, razed, razed to the ground. That means completely demolished, totally demolished. He further noted that the city, now listen, was so thoroughly laid even with the ground by those that dug it up to the foundation that there was nothing left to make those who came thither believe it had ever been inhabited. In other words, Josephus said that Jerusalem was in such rubble and laid in such barren that if anybody would come along later and see it, they would think, how in the world could that even be established or even be occupied? Think about that for just a minute. What was Jerusalem to the Jews? What was Jerusalem to the Jews?
Their home.
Their home. What else? What else? What was Jerusalem to the Jews? Think about that. What was this city to the Jews?
Wasn't it their promise? Their promised land?
Jerusalem was the very core of their faith. And to be honest with you, Jerusalem was the center of their world. And now it laid in ruin, just as Jesus had prophesied it to be. A gentleman by the name of Steve Fine, I found this to be interesting, and I didn't find this until just this study. I didn't know about this the first 3 times that I taught this book. He wrote a book called The Menorah from the Bible to Modern Israel. If you get a chance, and if you look at that book, it's a very interesting book. The Menorah from the Bible to Modern Israel. He recorded that even though Jerusalem was literally desolated, that many of the furnishings of the temple were destroyed, but though several of the implements were saved. He said the trumpets, the table of the bread of presence, and the lampstands were preserved and taken to Rome. Now it's interesting why they were taken to Rome. Remember, Titus was the one that finished up the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, Titus, he had and it's still there today. If you look at it online, he had a big ark that is called the Ark of Titus, and it's in Rome. And if you look at it, there are graphics on that ark, and the graphics on that ark of the trumpets, the bread of presence. I mean, the table of the bread of presence and the lampstand. It's interesting that ark was built to commemorate Titus's triumph over the destruction of Jerusalem, whenever that happened. Now, various implements from the temple, including the menorah and the showbread table, according to what Steve Fine said, it was preserved for many years in Rome. And as a matter of fact, to show you just what type of person that Vespasian was, he built, because of these implements of the menorah and the showbread table, he added that because he built his own, I guess you could say, temple called the Temple of Peace. But the Temple of Peace was built to honor the goddess Pax, P-A-X. She was a Roman goddess of peace. And once that was built, those particular emblems, the menorah and the showbread, was actually put inside of that temple, according to what Steve Fine said in his book. Now, when Titus died in AD 81, his younger brother Domitian ascended to the throne and became emperor. Now, on a side note, according to the Roman historians, and I have looked and looked and looked, it's highly suspicious And it's highly suspected that Domitian may have helped to hasten his brother's demise so he could ascend to the throne. He might have helped it out a little bit. But that was never proven and never said. That was only speculated by the historians. Well, Domitian was not as well liked or well received by the aristocracies as his father and brother had been. This seemed to have been due in part to his cruel and ostentatious behavior. Meaning, folks, he would put forth vulgar displays, nudity, sexual acts that was just horrendous, and even cruelty to others before others, designed to impress and so draw attention to himself, which I'm sure many found offensive. I know I would. But that's the type of person that we have and that we know and that the Christians are now going to live under. We know very little about Domitian until he rose to the throne. It is then that we learn what kind of emperor, as well as what kind of a person that Domitian was, from Eusebius, who referred to earlier writers who mentioned Domitian's dislike of. And folks, some of historians even mention a downright hatred towards Christians, and go on to say that Domitian stirred up persecutions of Christians and issued edicts against them. Now, let me ask you a question. Why do you think that Domitian had this kind of dislike or this type of downright hatred to Christians? Have you ever, or what would you think? Why would you think that Domitian would have this type of complete hatred towards Christians?
Because they would not worship him.
If you were a Roman emperor to the Roman Empire, you were seen as a god, little g. And as such, whoever it was that you seen his statue or anything about him, you bowed down to your knee towards him and honored him as that God. But that's something that Christians would not do. You know, folks, I saw a video several weeks ago of a North Korean girl that had escaped from North Korea and got down to South Korea, and that had come from South Korea, had learned English, and then had come over to the United States and was going to school over here for an education in college to go back to South Korea and to try to get her family in from North Korea. She said in this interview something that I didn't know and I thought was fascinating. She said every single house in North Korea, there is a picture of the dictator of North Korea. She said that every day that particular picture had to be completely dusted. The picture frame had to be cleaned. There could not be a single fingerprint on that picture or that picture frame or at all. She said that the police would come in the house unannounced and would walk up to that picture with a white glove, and if there was any dust found on that picture at all or any fingerprints, that that particular house would be subject to either be put in prison or worse, some of them even put to death. She said that in the event of a fire, it wasn't the fact of you trying to save your family. The first thing that was saved out of that house was the dictator's picture. That was the very first thing that had to come out of that house. And you had to hold that as your most loving and beloved possession over anything else. Now, apply that same type of mentality to the first century Christians, because Domitian expected the same type of service, the same type of worship. And if you do not give it to him, well, you were seen as you might as well say an enemy. An enemy. During this time in the Roman Empire, the overseas trade was becoming more and more important for Rome. The number of vessels sailing daily over the oceans, either from or towards Rome, were increasing almost weekly because of the trade and the products that were being moved because of the Roman Empire. Also, the number of owners of these vessels expanded completely steadily over time. And somewhere in the first century, and folks, we don't know the exact date, we don't know the exact time, the skippers of these ships and the owners got together and banded themselves a professional association called the Collegia. The Collegia, Collegia. Now, soon, many other businesses joined, and it grew extremely rapidly in the entire Roman Empire. And we're talking about in towns and cities in Italy, in North Africa, in Spain, and in France. But what is a collegium? What was the purpose? Who were the members? And how was the organization structured? Now, you might be asking yourself, why in the world is Cliff about to spend all this time on talking about the background and telling you about these guilds instead of let's go ahead and let's get to Revelation 1:1? Well, all of this, especially these guilds, folks, comes into play in this book. And especially when you get to chapter 13. Chapter 13, if you don't have an understanding about what these guilds are and why these guilds are there and what the purpose is of these guilds, then you can't understand why it is that it's so important. Let me ask you a question. Remember a few minutes ago, I told you that Domitian was seen as a god. Let's say for an example, you are a young mother. You have a baby. That baby is in your arms. You need to buy food for the day. You are a young Christian. You go down to the marketplace where the guild is, that different guilds that sells food. You have, mercy sakes, we'll go into this in just a few minutes. But you go up to this guild to buy meat, and they hold up the statue of Domitian, and they say, is this your God? If you don't bow down and say, yes, Domitian is my God, then guess what? You don't get served. You get no meat. You go and you try to buy milk, or you try to buy bread. You try to buy flour. And each one of these guilds that you go to, you try to buy for your food, and you have this, you have this small baby in your arm, and this baby is crying because this baby is hungry. And you go to try to buy the daily bread, the daily need. And the guild master holds up the statue of Domitian and say, is this your God? And if you say, no, Jehovah is my God, there's no food. There's no anything. You have to leave. You have to provide elsewhere, if there is elsewhere. In his extensive work, Roman Ostia, the British historian Russell Meigs describes a collegium as an organization in which members who share a common interest join together for mutual benefit. And these collegiums were called or known as guilds. Now, historians have distinguished three types of guilds that we have that was under the basically what the Christians in first century had to deal with. They were the collegia, the members of the common professionals. These could be merchants of clothing, if you went to try to buy clothes, merchants of food, merchants of building material. Think of a particular trade, and there was a guild for that trade. Merchants that the Jews would have to deal with on a one-on-one basis almost daily. The collegia of members who came together for special cult or specific god. Like I said, the Roman Empire, he was seen as a god. He was worshipped as a god. And if you did not worship him as a god, you could lose your life. A collegia as social association, just like with the Jews. They had common events and they celebrated special holidays, and there was associated banquets. And if you did not attend those banquets, you were banished. Now, let me state it this time, to the very best of my studies, I cannot find, and you may, and if you do, please let me know. But in my study, I cannot find anywhere where any Christians were part of any of these guilds, especially Jewish Christians. However, as stated earlier, they had to trade, they had to purchase their daily needs and necessities, and they had to work with these individuals. Now, guilds are first mentioned in Acts chapter 19 as a basis of organized opposition to the Christian church. These societies were not trade unions as in modern sense. Their functions were primarily social, like a group of people with a common interest. But records exist of guilds that were, let me read you some of these folks. They were guilds for bakers, bankers, doctors, architects, producers of linen, producers of woolen goods, dryers, workers in metal, workers in stone, workers in clay, builders, carpenters, farmers, pastry cooks, barbers, embalmers, and transport workers. Does that cover about the whole spectrum of business as we know it? Now, James, I don't see any car, shop here, but I'm sure if there was a car shop back then, we'd have a guild for it,
Somebody had to fix the chariot.
Yep, somebody had to fix the chariot, so I bet you there was a guild for chariot fixers, I mean, they literally was for everything else. Samuel Deal wrote in his book, Roman Society from Nero to Marcus Aurelius, and there again, this is a great book for this study. This is what he said. No other age felt a greater craving for some form of social life, greater than the family and narrower than the state. And what Samuel Deal was saying was that these guilds were even more important than the family. But as always, it had to be done lower than the emperor, because the emperor was God. These guilds satisfied the need of the humble for the pleasure of social interaction and the dignity of self-expression. Now, it was the guild of the silversmiths. Let me give you an example of just what these guilds can do and what these Christians have to deal with working these guilds. If you remember, the silversmiths and the associated trades that forced Paul to withdraw from Ephesus. If you remember the growing unrest and the potential danger caused by a riot instigated by the silversmith, do you remember what silversmith that caused that riot? Who was the name of the silversmith? Demetrius. Sure was. Who felt threatened by Paul. Why do you think that he, as a silversmith, felt so threatened by Paul? What about Paul's preaching would have made Demetrius feel so threatened? Well, what was Paul's preaching? That there was only one God and that idol worship was wrong. And as such, the preaching of the worship of Artemis declined. What did Demetrius do? And what did his guild do? They built statues of Artemis. Now, the Ephesians Artemis is different than the Greek Artemis. When you hear Artemis, always remember there's a difference between the Ephesian Artemis and the Greek Artemis. The Ephesian Artemis was the Ephesians a deity. They called her the Queen of Heaven, emphasizing on fertility, virginity, and the protection of the childbearing. It was the guild of silversmiths that formed the idols of Artemis for worship. Turn over to Acts chapter 19 and start looking at verse 24. Acts 19 and go down to verse 24. Paul started preaching against idols. Well, what did that do? Well, whenever Paul started preaching against idols, that cut into the prophets. Whenever he cut into the silversmith prophets, led by Demetrius, seeing that their idols were not being bought like they once were, it spurred a riot, and that's what is recorded here. Now, folks, I won't read the entire thing, but let me read starting in verse 24. For a man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen in similar trades and said, Men, you know that from this business we have our wealth. And you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with hands are not gods. And there is danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing. Now, will somebody pick up there and start with the last half of verse 27 and read through verse 41?
Through what?
Through 41.
41?
Mm-hmm.
And that she may even be disposed from her magnificence, she whom all Asia and the world worship. When they heard this, they were enraged and were crying out, Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. So the city was filled with the confusion, and they rushed together into the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians, who were Paul's companions in travel. But when Paul wished to go in among the crowd, the disciples would not let him. And even some of the Asiarchs, who were friends of his, sent to him and were urging him not to venture into the theater. Now some cried out one thing, some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. Some of the crowd prompted Alexander, whom the Jews had put forward, and Alexander, motioning with his hand, wanted to make a defense to the crowd. But when they recognized all that he was a Jew, for about 2 hours, they all cried out with one voice, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." And when the town clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, "Men of Ephesus, who is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is temple keeper of the great Artemis, and of the sacred stone that fell from the sky? Seeing then that these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash. For you have brought these men here who are neither sacrilegious nor blasphemers of our goddess. If therefore Demetrius and the craftsmen with him have a complaint against anyone, the courts are open, and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you seek anything further, it shall be settled in the regular assembly. For we really are in danger of being charged with rioting today, since there is no cause that we can give to justify this commotion." And he had said these things, or when he had said these things, he dismissed the assembly.
So let me ask you a question. Even though that nothing came of this, you can understand because of what was happening to the silversmith guild, it was cutting into their profit. Since it was cutting into their profit, they together acted as one. Now, where I guess you could say they made their mistake, they got others involved that didn't even know what they were doing down there and who that they were going against. And you also seen that they didn't let Paul go in, speculation that maybe Paul would have been in danger because that was who that Demetrius was basically keying on, but they held him back. So as you can see from this guild of silversmiths, they came together and was the cause of this instance that is written here because of what Paul was preaching, that cutting into their profit. It was a guild of the butchers. This is interesting, that sent names of Christians that would not bow down to the Emperor Trajan when purchasing meat to Pliny the Younger, who was a Roman governor of Bithynia in AD 112. Remember what was all Roman Empire to the Romans. All Roman emperors was God, and you had to bow down. And he was a god to them. So when the Christians would not bow down to the Emperor Trajan, they took names. When they took names, what they do with the names? They sent the names to Pliny, and Pliny had them executed. So here you are, a Christian, and you go to try to buy meat from the butcher, knowing that if the guild holds up this statue of whoever the emperor is at the time, in this case, it was Trajan, and you didn't bow down to it, possibility of you being killed, you being executed. The guild banquets with their associated worship of the patron deity and, shall I say, the compromising fellowship that was involved. Folks, that was just one of the problems Paul had to deal with whenever he first wrote the Corinthians about what they were doing. This is in Corinth. And this guild they were basically stirring up this worship. If you remember, you had What was Paul dealing with here in 1 Corinthians? Well, you had temple prostitutes. You had fornication. You had sexual acts. You even had one person who was living with his, I think, mother-in-law, if I remember correctly. So and they were celebrated, completely celebrated. So the banquet guild was something about that. And it was the attempt of certain guilds to work out forms of compromises so essential to the social comfort. What they would do, guys, is they would try to cut deals with Christians, knowing that they were not going to bow down. So what they would do is they would use it in their favor. Maybe this piece of bread would cost this much. I won't show you Domitian so that you will bow down. I won't take your name. But what I'll do is, instead of you paying this much for bread, now you're going to pay me this much for bread. Maybe if you were paying me this much for meat, since you won't bow down, and if you don't want me to write your name down and share your name, well, then you pay this much for meat. Or, you have some property. I'll take that property. Others, the historian says, oh, you have a beautiful wife. I'll take your wife. She'll now be my wife. Folks, the world that the Christians lived in here under Domitian, I cannot even describe how bad it was. All of this was indeed the livelihood of many Christians. And if you look at 2 Peter, if you look at Jude, and of course here in the book of Revelation, the Lord is going to deal with that through the writers of these books. Well, that just about sets the table of what the day-to-day life was for a Jew or for a Christian living under the Roman tyranny of Domitian. Let me ask you a question. It's soul-searching time. Is that a life that you would like to have to deal with on a day in and day out basis? How would that affect your faith? How would that affect my faith? How would that affect the way that I would conduct my life? Would I stand firm on the gospel, knowing that that might be the last day that I spend on this earth? That's why that the book is written in such a way that we have the Lord's blessed assurance that in Christ, no matter what, we have victory. And in Christ, no matter what, the battle has been fought and we win. Folks, I certainly would not have, I can't even imagine what they were dealing with. I can't. It would leave them in a feeling of being afraid for their very life on a day-to-day basis. Anytime that they had to go and anytime that they had to deal with purchasing anything for their necessity, those Christians had to deal with it. The feeling of hopelessness. There's no way out. It was in this world and it was in this time that the Lord seen what was happening. And he sent hope to Christians. by sending a revelation to John. Now, this book of Revelation is written in such a way that we're going to refer back to the Old Testament probably more than any other type of study that I can think of. Because it was written in such a way, and we're going to go into this, that if it fell into the hands of a Roman, they would look at it and they would say, what is this mess? What is this all about? But a Christian, especially a Jewish Christian, would know what it was talking about. So what we've got to do to better understand this book is to go back and put ourselves in the mindset of a Jew, looking at this letter with the knowledge that they had to understand what the symbolization means. It is going to be an undertaking in the study. I'm not going to get in any hurry. I'm not going to say that we're going to be through in 13 weeks. I'm not going to say that I'm going to be like we did in the study of Rome. We'll get through when we get through. I want us to study it in such a way that when we get through, I'm going to do my ever-loving best, folks, to make it as easy to understand as I possibly can. Remember this. When you study God's Word, you can take a big sledgehammer and you can take a round peg, and with enough force, you can drive it into a square hole. But that still doesn't mean that round peg fits in that square hole. If it doesn't fit like it's supposed to fit, folks, I'm not going to touch it. I'm not going to make the book of Revelation fit what the world wants it to say. Not going to do it. I'll tell you what the book of Revelation says. I'll tell you the symbolism. We'll refer back to the Old Testament to understand what the symbolism means and why the symbolism is there. And then when we get through with it, Lord's willing, then you'll be able to go out and refute when you hear contradictions of the book. There's only going to be 144,000 in heaven anyway.
That's right.
If you listen to some, we're going to talk about that for sure. Is there any question? And folks, I apologize for tonight. I hate teaching as a lecture. I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. I promise we won't do much of that. But I wanted you to understand just how bad these Christians had it at this particular time of the writing of this book. Any questions, any comments before we close up tonight?
Just thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Let's go to God in prayer. Father, I cannot even imagine. I don't even want to imagine, Lord, what the Christians in this time under the Emperor Domitian had to live through. The faith that they had, over the top, Lord, absolutely over the top. Can I match that faith? God, I don't know. But I pray, Father, that you would help strengthen all of our faith, to where in situations that may come up in our lives, that we will stand firm on your word, knowing that we, being in Jesus Christ, that the price has been paid. The battle has been fought. The battle has been won. And in Jesus, we stand as victors with him. Father, in Jesus, we win. And that's what this wonderful book teaches us, that we have your blessed assurance that with us in Christ, our future is laid out. And it's laid out wonderful. So, Father, I pray that you would bless us during this study. Please, Father, please help me. Help me, Father, to be able to teach it in such a way, as I said earlier, that even a child could understand it. Father, go with us. Give us a safe journey home. Thank you so much for everyone who has joined us tonight online and for everyone that is here present, Father. I pray that you would bless everyone who's heard this message tonight. And it's in Jesus' holy and righteous name we do pray. Amen. I love you, folks. Thank you so much.
Thank you.